You're listening to Ohio versus the World, an American history podcast. Subscribe and follow the show on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook or at our website, OhioVTheWorldPodcast.com. Ohio versus the World is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Go to evergreenpodcast.com for all our past episodes. Now here's your host, Alex Hasty.
Welcome back, everybody, to the midpoint of Season 6 of Ohio versus the World. It's Episode 6, Ohio versus Lawyering. We'll be talking about the most famous attorney in American history, Kinsman, Ohio native Clarence Darrow, the attorney for the damned, as he was called. By telling about his life and his biggest cases, we'll cover some of the biggest issues of his time in America that, sadly, are still major issues 100 years later in the 21st century. Remember that Ohio vs. the World is now part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Go to evergreenpodcast.com. You can hear all of our back episodes there. This is actually our 81st episode, so there's 80 for you to go back and listen to. And don't forget, we're part of an entire history channel on Evergreen. We're one of, I think, 8 shows, so go check them all out. And also be sure to hit the subscribe button. To all our iTunes listeners, the majority of you listen on iTunes. The new update kind of scrambled my podcasts on my phone. I had to go back in and subscribe to some of my favorite shows to see them more easily. So whatever service you use to listen to Ohio vs. the World, make sure you hit subscribe to get all our new episodes directly to your phone. And we've got so much to get to today, so I'll be brief. Today we have 4 amazing guests. One is a Pulitzer Prize winner in history for his book about the most famous Clarence Darrow case. Another was a National Book Award winner for his book on the Darrow case. We're also joined by the brilliant former president of the ACLU and one of the finest criminal defense attorneys in the state of Ohio. These are 4 of the most enjoyable interviews we've ever done, and it's made for a great episode. We'll introduce you to all 4 as we follow the career and the life of the greatest lawyer in American history. All rise, it's Episode 6, Ohio vs. Lawyering. Clarence Seward Darrow was born on April 18, 1857, in the small village of Farmdale in northeast Ohio, that Connecticut Western Reserve area of the state. His middle name Seward after the leading Republican and abolitionist politician William Seward of New York. True to his middle name, his parents were abolitionists and free thinkers for the 19th century. They moved to the nearby small town of Kinsman, which is where Clarence grew up. Our first guest is Ed Larson, an award-winning writer, professor of law and history at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. Beautiful campus right off Highway 1. And Ed knows Clarence Darrow as well as anybody. He wrote about Darrow's most famous trial, the Scopes Monkey trial of 1925, when he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1998 for his book Summer for the Gods. It's an amazing book and certainly worthy of the award. But in the dedication for the book, it says it's in the memory of my father, Rex Larson, a Darrow-like criminal lawyer. Ed grew up in Mansfield, Ohio, between Cleveland and Columbus, and we asked him about the similarities between Clarence Darrow and his late father and attorney, Rex Larson.
Darrow was up in Ashtabula, Ohio, is where he was a practicing lawyer. He grew up in Kinsman near the Pennsylvania state line, but gravitated toward Ashtabula. My father served in World War II and then went to law school on the GI Bill. And he had just grown to admire Clarence Darrow. During the 30s, while Darrow was still alive, he'd read about Darrow's trials. And of course, there were already some movies about some of them. He went to University of Michigan. I know that's a bad word for somebody from Ohio, but he went to University of Michigan to law school. He went to Ohio State undergrad. But he went to law school there because that's where Darrow went. And on the GI Bill, he could sort of go where he wanted. Before the war, he had taught school in Ashtabula. And I think that's where he became sort of a fan of Clarence Darrow. And he'd read about, Darrow was a master of jury selection and the closing argument. Those were 2 of the areas he really advanced. And my father found those fascinating. Darrow was a bit of a labor lawyer, and until my father became the prosecuting attorney, he represented some labor unions in Mansfield, back then quite an industrial small city. So he was just always fascinated by Darrow. And in a way, he had some similarities in the way he'd try a case, the way he'd sort of be like the small town lawyer talking to the jury. And it was that sense and some of those aspects of his life that he'd modeled after Darrow He smoked as heavily as Darrow, and and at a time drank as heavily. And so with all those similarities and his admiration, I had to be thinking about my father as I was writing about Clarence Darrow.
Our second guest is a friend and one of the best criminal lawyers in the state of Ohio, John Saya. John is someone I go to if I have a question about crim law, and he's a fan of the show, so we asked him to hop on and share his vast knowledge of another great Ohio defense attorney, Clarence Darrow. We'll talk about Darrow's rise to fame and glory throughout this episode, but there's one little-known case out of his days as a small-town lawyer in Ohio that I think shows the lengths that Clarence Darrow was willing to go to zealously advocate for his client. John talks to us about the seemingly unimportant case of Jewell v. Brockway that Darrow takes all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court as a young attorney.
Darrow was a fighter. He is known as the attorney for the damned. He took cases that were unwinnable and would somehow turn them into winners. And this particular case was early on in his career, and there was a town drunk, for lack of a better way of putting it, who fell ill and hired a young Brockway to take care of him as part of compensation of Brockway, a horse saddle. Eventually there was a guardian appointed for the town drunk, took the saddle back. Darrow took on the case for purportedly $5 fee, and the case lingered on for 9 years. The case went to trial in 1885. There was appeals sent back down for retrials. Eventually the case ends up in the Supreme Court. And in 1894, Darrow gets a win in the Supreme Court of Ohio and gets Brockway his $30 saddle. Well, by that point in time in Darrow's career, he had left Ohio around 1887 and moves to Chicago, becomes involved in Chicago politics, takes on some big cases, and he's involved in two of his major cases in his life by 1894, the time when this Supreme Court case is being decided.
Those two big cases that John's referring to are Darrow's first two really big media trials. His representation of labor leader Eugene Debs and his role in the nationwide labor strike known as the Pullman Strike in 1894. And in the same year, he's representing Patrick Prendergast, who's assassinated the mayor of Chicago, went to his house and killed him. But in 1887, Darrow's married with a son, Paul, has a fledgling law office in Ashtabula, Ohio, a city we've discussed many times on the show, tucked in the very northeast corner of the state, near the PA border, right on Lake Erie. Darrow makes a move that would change his life in American legal history. He decides to pack up everything and move to Chicago. We talked to Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ed Larson about Darrow's move to Chicago and his becoming America's leading defense attorney for the labor movement.
It was very common back then for Ohioans to, if they moved to the big city, to move to Chicago. Chicago at that time was probably the most dynamic city in America. It's the Chicago of Carl Sandburg, Chicago of Edgar Lee Masters, city of big shoulders, building those wonderful skyscrapers that they built, Chicago style. It was opening the West. Whatever New York had, and New York had a lot of energy then, Chicago equaled it. And so it was a place where Ohioans, being Midwesterners themselves, naturally gravitated. So he wasn't the only one. As you know from doing this program, Ohio during that period was one of the most dynamic, nurturing grounds for arts, literature, so many writers, so many actors, so many people who gained notoriety living in Chicago or New York or even Los Angeles came actually from Ohio, often from small towns like Clarence Darrow did. There was no place in Ohio that offered the dynamism for a rising, ambitious, really progressive lawyer. And he had been progressive from his father and his mother, who were both small town progressives in Kinsman, Ohio. Ashtabula was too small for him. He did get his footing there. He practiced law there. He actually left his wife and family behind, not knowing if he'd make it to Chicago. But when he got there, he got tied up with people like Edgar Lee Masters, who was also a lawyer as well as a writer, leaped into the cultural life of the city. He was a writer. He would write short stories for the local newspapers and some magazines, That got him some notoriety. He was a writer like Jack London. It was that sort of realism. He got a job because the government was controlled by the Democrats. And he got a job working for the city, and he got a job working for the local transit company. But he left that during the Great Pullman Strike and represented Eugene V. Debs. First, built a reputation that extended beyond Chicago. His relatively successful defense, his vigorous defense, let's call it that,
there you go,
of labor, captured the attention. And that time, labor was as militant as it ever was in American history. And it was trying to cut its place in American society. Many employers were as hardened as they ever were fighting it. It was a strong divide. It was the era of, in Ohio, and like William McKinley and Mark Hanna versus the progressives like William Jennings Bryan. And in that age, Darrow gained a footing as the thanks to his defense of Debs and others, as really the leading defense lawyer for labor.
Darrow becomes an institution, a celebrity in the Windy City. His home becomes a salon of sorts for artists and writers. Parties, intellectual sessions, alcohol flowed, and women were part of that scene as well. Darrow was an atheist. He called himself an agnostic, but his father Amaris was known kind of as the village atheist back in Kinsman, Ohio. We could have just talked about Darrow and his bohemian lifestyle for 20 minutes. We asked John Saya, attorney here in Columbus, Ohio, about Darrow's lifestyle that was so much a departure from the Victorian age ethics of the early 20th century.
Well, Clarence Darrow was very liberal and very forward thinking, especially for his time. It was a city that had a number of private clubs of all different variations, and Darrow became involved in some of these intellectual clubs. And he hung around with the elite of Chicago at that point in time. There was a lot of attorneys, doctors, judges, philosophers, college professors, and they would get together, and they were kind of the free thinkers of the day. And Darrow really took to that kind of lifestyle. He became very active in women's suffrage, despite the fact that he was also very much thought of as a womanizer. He was part of what was called the Free Love Society at the time. He was married, had affairs that were known, divorced, remarried, continued on with affairs, pretty much an open book. Being divorced early on in his career, he supported his first wife for virtually his entire life. So he considered himself agnostic. So interestingly enough, he gave a famous speech here in Columbus, Ohio. The title of the speech was "Why I Am an Agnostic." And in 1929, he came to Columbus, Ohio, and participated in a symposium. That speech you can find on the internet and read through it, and he explains why he is agnostic. His views are rather interesting, and actually he makes a compelling argument to explain why he's agnostic.
Darrow continues to rise in fame in the first decade of the 20th century. Cases like his defense of labor activist Big Bill Haywood, accused of the assassination of the former governor of Idaho. He gets him acquitted. But Darrow takes a similarly high-profile case out in Los Angeles in 1911. The LA Times, then a very conservative paper owned and run by ultra-conservative Harrison Gray Otis, a former Union general from Marietta, Ohio. The LA Times is an open shop, meaning unions were not allowed at the newspaper. Two brothers, the McNamara's, two labor radicals, traveled to LA, and they blew up the LA Times with dynamite. They did it overnight, but what they didn't count on was a number of employees would be there late that night working on a special edition of the paper. John Saya tells us about the LA Times bombing case.
It was a huge deal. There was 20 people were murdered in the LA Times building during that bombing. LA Times was a non-union newspaper. There was a plot to plant bombs, not only in the building itself, but also at the home of Otis of the LA Times. The bombs that were placed at or near the Otis home were not detonated. However, the ones at the LA Times building were. So the McNamara's were two brothers, went out to the LA area for the purpose to get the unions in the LA Times. One of the brothers came up with the idea of planting the bombs. Darrow was brought in on the case by the union representatives. Very early on in the case, was just convinced that the case was absolutely unwinnable. At that point in time, executions were fairly common in these types of cases in the United States, and they were done rather quickly too, not at all like today's delays of 15 or 20 years. Executions were carried out pretty quickly, and juries and courts were pretty freely issuing or ordering sentences of death. So Darrow was really concerned about these two brothers both being sentenced to death and being executed.
The case took the nation by storm, and with being the attorney for the damned and the leading defense attorney for the labor movement, his appearance in the case just only heightened the atmosphere. He's hired by the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, actually founded by Samuel Gompers right here in Columbus, Ohio. We now know it as the AFL-CIO. Darrow and the unions would set to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for the McNamara brothers' defense. A lot of that money went to Darrow, so much that this would become really his last case for Darrow to represent labor unions. Darrow became convinced of the brothers' guilt in this terrorist attack, and the strength of the state's case against him just blew him away. He's desperate. Everyone expected him to pull off another miracle, but in this case he knew it wasn't going to happen. So he made a decision that would perhaps end his career.
So it was a large sum of money. So Darrow told the AFL that the defense would cost at least $350,000, which in today's dollars would be just an incredible amount of money. He was originally paid $50,000 for his fee for the defense, and although the AFL was not able to raise the entire amount of the $350,000, they did raise somewhere in the neighborhood of an additional $150,000 to $200,000. As the case was preparing to go to trial, Darrow was able to get a list of the jurors for the trial, as was common in the day. So the attorneys were provided a list, and as the story goes, Darrow bribed at least two of the jurors. His investigator is actually caught handing over $4,000 to a juror on the case. He turned state's evidence and is the main witness against Clarence Darrow in the first jury tampering trial. He was actually charged twice with jury tampering in the McNamara case. That may have played a major role in pleading these two brothers guilty. It all happened around the same time, and the plea deal that Darrow was able to work was to save both their lives, although one of the brothers was sentenced to life in prison, while the other brother received somewhere between a 10 and 15-year sentence.
Clarence Darrow's on trial for his legal career and his legacy, maybe even his freedom. He's charged with attempting to bribe a juror, and there's plenty of evidence and witnesses against him. Attorney John Saya takes us through both of Clarence Darrow's trials, where he is the defendant.
All the evidence points towards the fact that he did this. Darrow hires the top lawyer in California at the time, an attorney by the name of Earl Rogers. First trial goes wonderful for Darrow. So Earl Rogers is there presenting the defense for Darrow, and the jury comes back not guilty with regard to the first bribery. Then there's a second trial, and during the second trial, Rogers takes ill in the middle of the trial, and Darrow actually has to represent himself for portions of that trial. Second trial ends up in a hung jury, and after consideration, the state decides not to go forward with the trial. So he ends up really walking away and not being convicted of either of the jury tampering charges, but it really damages his reputation. And then with the amount of fees that were paid to him by the union, and then him entering a plea for the McNamara brothers, just really destroyed his ability to go on and continue to represent the union.
Darrow would limp back to Chicago, bruised and disgraced. He's even broke, but he was too talented to be kept down for long. He becomes exclusively a criminal defense attorney, doing murder cases, high-profile criminal cases. But Darrow lives in a very different time than we live in now in America. Our rights to protest, our rights to free speech, they did not exist in any fashion you would recognize today. The issue of civil liberties became a passion for Darrow. At the same time, the American Civil Liberties Union was born to protect the individual rights and liberties under the Constitution. Our third guest, Nadine Strawson, was the former president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. She's at the forefront of fighting for these civil liberties. She was an awesome interview, and we talked to her about the birth of the ACLU, why it was necessary, and the role Clarence Darrow would play in their early years.
The ACLU was founded in 1920 precisely in order to try to put some real teeth into the paper but toothless guarantees of free speech and other individual rights in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment and its free speech guarantee. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are not self-executing. They only come into force and make a difference when people understand what their rights are willing to demand that government respect their rights, and there are lawyers and other experts who are able to advocate for those rights. The Supreme Court didn't even have an opportunity to rule on a free speech claim until the 20th century. And indeed, one of the major reasons for the founding of what ultimately became the ACLU was the rampant violation of what we now consider to be deeply entrenched, really fundamental free speech rights, namely the right of we, the people, to criticize government officials, to criticize government policies, to dissent from popular political positions. One of the statistics that kind of hammers it home is that during the World War I era, 15,000 people were arrested merely for peacefully criticizing the war and war policies. And many of these people served time in jail. Many of them were members of the clergy who believed that the war was inconsistent with principles of Christianity and other major religions.
I learned so much from talking with Nadine just about how different things were. The First Amendment was not something that you were just granted back in the 1910s, 1920s. But as we move forward to the Roaring 20s, this is a decade where Darrow became the most famous lawyer in America. We're going to discuss his three most famous cases, all during really an 18-month period from 1924 to 1926. The first of those three cases is the murder trial of Leopold and Loeb, one of the most sensational murder trials in American history, the killing of a 14-year-old boy, Bobby Franks, in Chicago, by the wealthy and brilliant young Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. It's in the summer of 1924. It's a grisly murder. Leopold and Loeb are like 19 years old, beyond intelligent, but they were disturbed young men. They wanted to commit the perfect crime, they called it. And they got caught. But they bragged to the press. They're laughing during some of these early hearings. And to many, these two symbolized everything that was wrong with America and its immoral youth in the Jazz Age. We ask author Ed Larson to tell us why this murder struck a chord with the entire country.
The Leopold Loeb trial just hit every hot button. Remember, this was a time of journalistic sensation. This is a time when you had yellow journalism at its height. And this just played in. So now remember, this is a time when there's like a murder a night in Chicago. This is the height of gangland. So it wasn't unusual to have murders all the time. But this was an interesting story because it wasn't a gangland murder. Here were two rich, able, smart college graduates, teenage graduates, one of Chicago, University of Chicago, the other of University of Michigan. They'd grown up together in Hyde Park, a wealthy Jewish suburb. And Loeb's father was the president, the acting president of Sears Roebuck, a store in America. Everybody went to Sears Roebuck. Here was the son of the acting president. Leopold's father was successful as well. They were reputed to be homosexual. Actually, only one was. The story was these rich Jewish homosexuals murder this young boy. The stories had that they sodomized him. That was not true, but you couldn't stop the press from reporting anything. Kidnapping was common then. Remember, the Limburg kidnapping was about that same era. So that hit a lot of the fright. And also, these were boys whose ends up defense be they read Nietzsche. They read modern philosophy and the idea of the Superman. So it played into religious concerns about people learning about survival of the fittest, and people were more able. Remember, it's sort of like the story in a way of Crime and Punishment, of people thinking they're Superman and then get away with killing people. It fed into too many stories. The way it unfolded, they didn't know who it was. The press got involved. This young man who disappeared, didn't know what happened to him. The kidnap note comes. The guy doesn't reappear. Who did it? The body's found. It unfolded over a week. And then the Chicago press was linked into national news like the Hearst newspapers and the Pulitzer newspapers, which then carried the story. And it just exploded over time. And it became the sensation of the summer at a time when the press loved sensations. It was the O.J. Simpson trial of its era.
The real cause of crime is poverty, ignorance, hard luck, and generally youth. When we look at the prisoners in the jails, we find that all of them practically are poor. At least 9/10 began what they call a criminal career as mere children.
Clarence Darrow, as much as he played the aw shucks country lawyer card with his suspenders, layback, Ohio drawl, he was forward-thinking when it came to his thoughts on criminal justice. He made the connection between environment and upbringing, criminality, the role of poverty in making someone a criminal. He got that 100 years ahead of some of the judges I practiced in front of in the last 13 years. We talk with Ed Larson about Darrow's representation of Leopold and Loeb and his lifelong opposition to the death penalty.
Well, Darrow was at the time was already the most famous defense lawyer in America. He had been practicing law in Chicago for over 30 years. And he normally, would have no sympathy for rich murderers. But the family of the defendants came to him, pleaded with him for a substantial sum, defend Leopold and Loeb. Darrow volunteered his services at the Scopes trial. He did not volunteer here. He was going to get a large payment. And Darrow was the highest paid defense lawyers in America at that time. And he was a specialist in murder cases. He had handled dozens and dozens and dozens of murder cases, and none of his, he's so effective that none of his, at a time when the capital punishment was very common and often enforced, not a single one of his, the people he defended, men or women he defended, was ever executed. That was true throughout his life. Not one was ever executed. Now, the problem was the boys had already confessed. What he had to do was make an argument that would lead to mercy in the sense that they would be sentenced to life imprisonment rather than the capital punishment. He had always been opposed to capital punishment because, remember, he was a libertarian, and he did not think you could trust the state with the power to kill someone because he believed that the verdicts were often wrong. Will Rogers, about this time, Will Rogers was the most popular sort of commentator in America at the time, became a film star, but he was a newspaper columnist. And he had said that the Anglo-American legal system is the best engine ever devised by the mind of man to determine who has the best lawyer. Darrow thought that most times poor Black people and poor white people, for that matter, didn't have very good lawyers. And therefore, capital punishment would be inequitably applied. He also just didn't trust the state with that power. He was not liberal in that sense. He was a social liberal, but he didn't trust government. He ended up, of course, ending his life fighting the New Deal, fighting Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, because he didn't like government intervention. It was that combination that made him distrust and oppose capital punishment as a matter of principle.
This Leopold and Loeb murder trial had fascinated the country. But it wasn't like a whodunit kind of trial. The boys had confessed before Darrow was even hired. He's there to present a case about their shattered past, their mental states during the murders, and he saved his best for last. Darrow's 3-day closing argument. You heard me right, 3 days, masterclass. He argued against capital punishment itself. He talked about youth, and also the state of Illinois had never executed defendants so young, or at least not in a long time. And the country and the judge whose decision it was as to life or death, they hung on every word.
The closing argument is incredibly powerful indictment of capital punishment and a tremendously moving plea for mercy of Shakespearean quality. And the trial was closely followed. The newspapers all over the country were following it. And it did have a lasting effect, not lasting effect in the technical legal sense that it didn't overturn capital punishment. But he moved the judge to show enough mercy to give these young men, they were basically 20, 21 by this time, but they had been teenagers when they committed the crime, not to sentence them to death. And indeed, one is killed in prison. The other one actually later gets out, for a successful career after that as a humanitarian in Puerto Rico. Just as you could say the Scopes trial gave backbone to the anti-evolution movement in America, the Leopold and Loeb really gives a backbone and a framework for the anti-capital punishment movement in America. Thereafter, even though capital punishment survives to this day, it's a little bit on its heels, in part because of the arguments that Darrow articulated. And even those people who didn't like Darrow, many Christians, especially in the more progressive churches or in the mainline churches, these arguments resonated with them. Appeal for mercy. And he plays on Christian themes. He plays on the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. He plays on determinism, the natural injustice of the criminal justice system, and he plays on concerns about giving government too much power. He plays every string on that fiddle, and he plays it beautifully. I would say, though, your statement, the one place I'd kick back is, yes, it is one of his two greatest, most impactful statements. But the other would be a couple of years later at the Sweet trial in Detroit, where if you read that closing argument on racism and on racial justice, you're literally in tears. Bailiffs and the judges would be crying during his statements. That's what they said. There was not a dry eye in the house. And he knew how to, as I said, he was a showman. He knew how to make his cases. And I do think that the closing argument in those two cases made a lasting difference.
This episode is brought to you by HP Plus. In a world full of smart devices, shouldn't your printer be smart too? It is with HP Plus. These printers know when they're running low, so you always get the ink you need delivered right when you need it. Plus, you save up to 50% on ink, so you can print whatever you want, as much as you want, anytime you want. Huh, that is pretty smart. Get 6 free months of instant ink when you choose HP Plus. Conditions apply. Visit hp.com/smart for details.
As we move forward to the second case that we'll dive in deep on, it's probably Darrow's most famous case. In March 1925, the Tennessee legislature passed the Butler Act. It prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. It's the culmination of lobbying efforts by fundamentalist Christians to reinstitute creationism in our country's classrooms, the Old Testament version of the origins of man. The ACLU seized on the Tennessee law and offered to represent anyone charged with violating the anti-evolution statute. Nadine Strawson, the former president of the ACLU, joins us, and she explains how the ACLU set up the Scopes monkey trial. And Clarence Darrow, a founding member of the ACLU, would head the challenge of the Butler Act.
The Tennessee law that was challenged in the Scopes case was similar to a flurry of laws that were being passed across this country in a backlash against increasing support for evolution and a movement toward secularism and a freeing up of society in general. So there was a reaction against that, and the law prohibited the teaching of evolution not only in public schools, but even in public universities. The ACLU in the days before Google and the internet had Roger Baldwin was the founding executive director of the ACLU, a very charismatic, dynamic leader. His assistant would read and clip newspapers from around the country looking for civil liberties issues, and she found a news item, probably in a regional newspaper, that mentioned this Tennessee law and brought it to Baldwin's attention. And Baldwin actually took out an ad seeking a school teacher who would be willing to defy the law and challenge it. And that's how John Scopes came to the ACLU's attention. The ACLU continued to be the primary supporter of the case. Clarence Darrow is justly famous for having been the lead lawyer in the case, but his partner, who was also a lawyer in the case, was one of the ACLU's general counsel, Arthur Garfield Hayes.
John Scopes was a football coach in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. He occasionally subbed for some science classes, and he volunteered to be the teacher that challenged the law, working with city leaders in Dayton, Tennessee. They wanted this circus of a trial that would follow. I mean, being found guilty was only a maximum $100 fine for Scopes, but what made this trial so popular across the country was the media. Not just the newspapers. This was a news event that was experienced across the country in real time. This is something new. It's something we take for granted. But radio, moving pictures, traditional journalism all joined forces to bring America this epic battle between science and religion. But another thing we had in the 1920s was really the explosion of celebrities. The famous Clarence Darrow was going to be defending Scope, and on the side of Tennessee, along with the state attorney general, would be the great commenter William Jennings Bryan, 3 times the Democratic nominee for president beginning in 1896, when he lost to Ohioan William McKinley. You can go back last season, we did an entire season on Ohio's presidents and different Ohio presidential history, and you can listen to our episodes on McKinley, who he lost to twice, or William Howard Taft, who he lost to in 1908. You can hear a lot more about Bryan, but he was a huge deal. This combination of modern media attention, celebrity appeal, made Scopes the story of the summer in 1925. Ed Larson, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on Darrow, Bryan, and the Scopes trial, joins us again to talk about this show trial and how it became such a flashpoint in American history.
It was the media that propelled the Scopes trial because it wasn't a serious trial, as you say. And Bryan, when he arrived, he said, the only fine, the only possible penalty, Bryan offered to pay it himself if he won the principle that public school teachers in Tennessee should not teach that humans evolved from a lower form of animal. The law didn't even bar teaching evolution. It only barred teaching human evolution. And arguably, it's not quite clear. Arguably, you could only not teach it as true. You could still teach it as a theory. The 20s were a celebrity age. During the 20s, you had the emergence of radio. You had a proliferation of newspapers that were widely read, and you had the rise of celebrity journalism. You had people like Babe Ruth in baseball. You had people like Mary Pickford. You had the rise of film, which of course you didn't really have local movie theaters before the 1920s. They were very small scale before that. So all of that, they grabbed onto the Scopes trial, which they billed as quite unlike what was really happening. They billed as small town, rural South fighting an accepted scientific theory. The reporters, the best reporters in America, descended on Dayton. They laid telegraph wires into town so they could actually telegraph out every word spoken. They had all these transcribers. They had a live radio broadcast, the first broadcast trial in American history, tied up when it was working, when the wires were working and they would come down in thunderstorms. They would actually be broadcast nationwide. It was filmed. You could see, when you see pictures of it, you see the cameras in the corners. They would film the trial. And fly planes out. They plowed down one of the local cornfields so airplanes could land for the first time in Dayton, and they'd fly off the film that night. So the next day, you could watch the trial in movie theaters in Cleveland and some other towns. Cleveland was the only one in Ohio. You could go down and watch it. Of course, they were silent, so you'd have people reading the transcript and watch basically the entire trial with Darrow. You could see the speeches, you could see the activities, you could sit there right in Cleveland the next day and watch it with people reading the script alongside. Every major newspaper in America ran the word for word daily transcript.
Nadine Strawson joins us again to talk about Clarence Darrow and his relationship with the ACLU, which becomes a little strained in the build-up to this trial in 1925. She talks about how the American Civil Liberties Union leaders maybe even wanted him removed as the defense counsel.
Clarence Darrow was very involved with the ACLU from the beginning. He was even active in the prior organization that gave rise to the ACLU. Nonetheless, he was a controversial figure because he was very flamboyant and he had certain ideas about how the case should be tried, which didn't necessarily square with those of other ACLU leaders. The client is the one who gets to decide major matters, such as who is going to be my lawyer. And some leaders in the ACLU were trying to pressure John Scopes to fire Clarence Darrow and to use Arthur Garfield Hayes. Scopes decided to stay with the team of Darrow and Hayes.
As the trial gets underway in Dayton, Tennessee, there's immediately a big argument about the use of experts. Darrow, they were going to spend weeks laying the case for why evolution is not just a theory but scientific fact. And to do that, Darrow and the ACLU brought in experts from all over the country. William Jennings Bryan, who had spent the last 5 years crisscrossing the country trying to tear down evolution and promote creationism and his religious beliefs, he changes tactics at the last minute. He sees this mountain of scientific evidence and experts that Darrow's planning to present at the trial. Ed Larson talks to us about how the trial proceeds and how Bryan's challenge to expert testimony changed the trajectory of the Scopes Monkey trial.
The trial had been billed as the battle of the century, even before it began. And the original idea that had started with Bryan, not Darrow. Back then, there was something called the Chautauqua. There were Chautauquas in Cleveland and outside Columbus and outside Cincinnati. Of course, there's still one of the few existing Chautauquas left. One of the only 4 left is in Ohio, Lakeside, Ohio.
Oh, yeah. I've been to Lakeside.
Yeah. And so you have one of the 4 left. Well, that's how they build it. They thought they could, this tiny town of Dayton, about 2,500 people strong, could have a summer event where they would bring in great speakers to debate the issue of evolution and its restriction. Darrow and the ACLU were able to find a lot of good expert witnesses, but Bryan couldn't find any who would come to testify on his side, except some really crackpot ministers who would not. Bryan was a national politician. He knew what would play on a national stage and not these speakers. He then reversed course and said that expert witness were inadmissible. Expert testimony was inadmissible because the only question he now shifted at the last minute after the defense had already brought in its stellar expert witnesses, from Princeton and University of Chicago and Nashville, Tennessee, and all over. And it was quite a star-studded lineup. Bryan realized he was going to be clobbered in the media. And this was a media trial, they'd said from the beginning. It was a show trial that was going to be broadcast. He said, you can't litigate the justice of the law, the constitutionality of the law. That can only be done under Tennessee law, and he was right, by the state Supreme Court. The local trial court simply had to enforce the law as written, and then the Supreme Court of Tennessee could gauge its constitutionality. So Bryan took this position, which just, of course, frustrated Darrow and the news media tremendously, because they were, and the townspeople who wanted to see this big show trial and hear this testimony and attend this summer Chautauqua. But of course he was going to win because that's what the law said. And the only issue was whether Scopes actually taught it. The reason why that was odd is that Scopes never taught evolution. He wasn't a biology teacher. He was a football coach who had volunteered to stand as a witness. So he had to. So he couldn't take the stand himself, because when asked the question, do you ever teach evolution, he'd have to say no. So they didn't want that. They wanted there to be a trial, so at least it could be appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court. The trial, instead of going on for weeks as planned, literally was thought it would go on for 6-8 weeks. It only took a few days. Most of it not in the courtroom, most of it the judge deciding whether to admit expert witnesses or not, so there wasn't any time in the courtroom. All of these witnesses couldn't testify. And once Darrow realized that Bryan would probably win on the argument, he came up with an alternative idea.
It was Darrow's quick thinking that made the Scopes trial memorable. The showdown between science and religion that would play out with Darrow and Bryan on each respective side. Ed Larson talks to us about the trap that Darrow sets for William Jennings Bryan, the religious former leader of the Democratic Party, and he walks right into it.
Well, even Bryan's fan thought Bryan came out worse in the deal. But as they would say, who wouldn't look like a fool if you were being cross-examined by Clarence Darrow? And that's what it was. You're right. You're being a lawyer, you know the difference between it. Darrow called him, but the judge certified him as a hostile witness, and therefore Darrow could actually cross-examine him. He didn't, even though he was his own witness, he could use all the techniques of cross-examination, which are, of course, are a lot more effective. And he said, what I'll do is I'll surprise him. On the last day when we're going to go to closing arguments, I'll waive my closing argument, but instead call him to the stand. And meanwhile, during the entire week of the trial, he kept goading Bryan. You can read it in the transcript. And then also his statements to the press that Bryan is scared. Bryan won't get up there. Bryan won't hold the trial. Bryan won't bring witnesses. Bryan said this was going to be a battle royal with evolution. He said that. What he was doing is he was setting him up. I mean, he admitted this afterwards. Spent a week setting him up. And then on Monday, when they're only supposed to do closing arguments, he sprung on, let me call one expert witness. No, you can't hear expert witnesses. No, this one, what if this one agrees to come? And what if the prosecution agrees? And the judge sort of tilts his head and said, well, I guess if the prosecution agrees, who do you have in mind? I want to call a person who claims he's an expert on the Bible, one that even they can't object to, and that is Bryan. Now, the judge just didn't know what to say, but Bryan insisted on going up there.
Darrow calls William Jennings Bryan to the stand, and the battle is played out on the radio for the whole country to hear. It doesn't go well for the great commenter, as he was known. I encourage you to read the transcript of this battle. Darrow had been preparing for this unknowingly his whole life. His father, Amorous, had asked these questions about a literal interpretation of the Bible for Clarence's entire childhood. Ed Larson talks through one of the most famous court testimonies in American legal history, the day in the summer of 1925 when Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan duked it out over the Bible, evolution, and the role of science.
He said, I'll go up and testify. He thought he'd be asked questions about evolution, and he had been speaking against evolution for 5 years in many different speeches and books. And so he had good answers ready about evolution. That's what he thought he'd be asked about. Clarence Darrow is too smart for that. As every lawyer learns in law school, you never ask a question to a witness where the answer could hurt you. You only ask questions that you already know the answer to, or ones, no matter what they say, it's going to help you. And nobody knew this better than Clarence Darrow. So Darrow never asked a single question about evolution. What he does is he peppers him on things like, is the Bible literally true? Do you believe in Adam and Eve? Do you believe in Noah's Ark? Where did Cain get his wife?
That's a good one. Yeah, I like
all that sort of thing. The classic village atheist questions that his dad had asked and that he had asked for years, and which they knew there is no possible good answer to them. The educated audience, you just sound foolish. And so that's what he did. And it goes on and on and on. He asked about ancient civilizations. Bryan, who is quite sophisticated, like many evangelicals of that day, fully accepted the scientific evidence of an old earth. that there were dinosaurs and there were vast periods and there was, the world was, in fact, on the stand, when he asked how old the earth is, all he could say was, I don't care whether it's 6,000 years old or 600,000 years old or 600 million years old. I say that the days of creation are ages of time, ages of geological time. Well, that's a funny answer because you lose your own fundamentalist following with that answer, but you also admit, as Darrow pointed out, as the defense pointed out, you admit that the Bible has to be interpreted. So why can't we interpret it, the Bible as well? So Brian just kept sinking deeper and deeper and deeper in the hole and getting more and more frustrated and insisted on battling on until finally, after 2.5 hours, the judge stopped it and said he just wouldn't let this humiliation go on any longer.
Brian never gets the chance to take his case to the country for this anti-evolution bill. He would die 5 days after the trial ends. He's still in Dayton, Tennessee. And Darrow outmaneuvers him in another important way at the end of the trial. Brian agreed to testify against Darrow in part because he didn't want to look like he was afraid to engage, the village atheist, but also he had a planned out closing argument. The testimony stunt would bring more attention to the trial's finale. But Darrow informs the court that he will forego his closing statement after he rips Brian to shreds. And under Tennessee law, that meant that the prosecution couldn't give a close either. Brian's just thoroughly out-lawyered by Darrow. We ask Ed Larson about the legacy that this trial left, and how really it's the first major battle in these culture wars that we're living through today, in this epic struggle between science and religion.
It is interesting that before Scopes,